Right, just introduce myself. My name is Chris McQuirk and I'm a lecturer in ESOL and EFL at the University of Central Lancashire. I'm also a fairly early career researcher, so this is kind of a theoretical presentation in some senses, talking about some of my current research. And this is the idea of the L2 virtual self. Now, these are called Musings because, to be honest, it is still a theory very much evolving. But I think it's quite an interesting one. I'd like to share some of those ideas with you today, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. So, to begin with, I'm going to draw your attention to some observations from Mills and Tincture. The implication that teachers in general are unlikely to engage with learning technology in some contexts. How's that? Is that better? Good. Let's try that again. The implication is that teachers in general are unlikely to engage with learning tech in certain contexts. Now, some of those ideas may be access to tech. It could also be know-how on how to use the technology. Agnes made an important point as well about fear of being replaced by the tech. But in a recent article, Pegram took it further and actually argued that our students are developing their approaches to learning at the same rate as technology is developing, but teachers aren't. So in some senses, we're kind of behind on a lot of developments, particularly in certain contexts. Language schools, for instance, CPD still focuses on relatively older approaches to using computer-assisted language learning in class. So it got me thinking about a number of different approaches to how students learn. And I'd like to talk next about creating identities online. We all have identities, specific usernames for special purposes, whether they be social media, virtual learning environments, virtual worlds, although I appreciate research on Second Life and active worlds is kind of dead these days. But Norton did make an interesting point back in 2001 about our learners feeling part of an imagined global community. Our definition of community has changed a lot, really. Because we have the access to the internet and social media, we can now communicate with anyone in any country. And to an extent, it is reshaping how we interact. And it gave me this idea of a dissociative digital identity. So a role that students create in an online presence that may be separate of the classroom context. And this gave rise to an idea of a second language virtual self, which we're going to talk about in more detail here. For me, there are obvious benefits of engaging with a different self that a learner might have online. One of the big ones is that students may see an increase in self-confidence or self-efficacy. They don't feel quite so judged in an online space, for instance, and because they're not surrounded by their peers, they've not necessarily got pressure to perform. The second one is students may take more risks with the language they use. Certainly on some exercises, there is quite a lot of more interesting language output when students go online. And the third one is there are students who may be quite reticent in class, but may be more confident to participate more in an online setting. So for me, this idea of the L2 virtual self kind of gives rise to three notions that have come up in my general reading. And that's, the first one is sense making, which Kopp came up with in 2011, and we're going to talk about that some more later. The second one is the idea of designing meaning, which is Pegram's more recent one in 2016. And the third one is the idea of knowledge building, which we'll look at over the course of this presentation anyway to make it clearer as we go along. But first, you kind of have to look at the psychological underpinnings of why I've got this idea of an L2 virtual self in my head. And that's a case of looking at dissociative identity disorder, the idea of somebody having multiple personalities. Now, I would just stress that the psychological research probably doesn't help us in terms of looking at language learning, because if you look at, for example, Spanos in 1996, he suggests that it's designed to cope with trauma. and in some cases possibly extreme trauma. Now, I don't necessarily see language learning as a traumatic experience, and I assume most of you agree with me on that one. So it doesn't really work as an analogy in that sense. However, when you look at some research from 1999 by Lilienfeld and his colleagues, they suggest it's actually a result of any kind of traumatic or uncomfortable experience. Now, uncomfortable is probably more appropriate here, because then we talk about factors influencing self-efficacy. Krashen's affective filter could come in here if you feel that sense of discomfort. So you can say then that discomfort experience when learning a language could lead to potentially a similar coping strategy, maybe. And it's at this point that educational psychology factors came in for me, specifically Bandura and the 4 factors influencing self-efficacy. So you've got inactive experience, the experience of learning by doing or trying something. Vicarious, the experience of other people trying or doing that action. Social persuasion, that's where peer pressure could come in and influence from people around you. And of course, aroused emotional state. So in that sense, the feeling of when you're asked to do something, it could be fear, it could be anxiety, but it could also be excitement, adrenaline, happiness in a sense. So all of these can have positive and negative factors in a number of ways. The thing is, though, what we want to do is nurture the positive side of it, and that's where the first concept of the 3 I mentioned comes in. That's knowledge building. Now, Scadamali and Bright have written extensively on the idea of knowledge building, and it's essentially the idea of a virtual world, kind of a safe place in a sense for students to contribute their ideas, build up their bank of knowledge and information, but also discuss their thoughts and perceptions of the world they're in. It's quite an important point in the sense of developing identity, and that identity aspect, the development of a self, is where a lot of this theory I'm generating at the moment is going. Other things to bear in mind: sociocultural theory, transformative learning linked very much to this idea of developing an identity, so none of that's new. Vygotsky was talking about it in the 30s, and transformative learning was Freire with pedagogy of the oppressed. So none of that's new, but how we look at it may be the next step forward. Okay. Now, though, you come on to probably the thing our students engage with more often than most, and that's mobiles. And mobile-assisted language learning. Most people have mobile phones, they use apps all the time. What's interesting for me is that Pegram makes a point of identity development as quite a core principle of computer-mediated communication. So students are using these spaces to reaffirm, discuss, negotiate their identity in an online space. He goes on a bit further with that, describing learners as designers of meaning. So there's very much this idea of trying to form an understanding that enables the world around you to make sense. If we're talking from a socio-constructivist perspective, that's very helpful in terms of boosting students' confidence. If they feel sure of themselves, they will be more confident and they're likely to perform more. Having said that, you could also look at things like virtual worlds for this. Now, Peterson did some research on active worlds, which obviously is now obsolete, but the ideas are quite important here. He argued that students seem to perform better under an assumed handle, an assumed username, and generally they felt more confident when they weren't playing as themselves. This was backed up by Yi in 2009, talking about online games. But it actually goes deeper than that if you look at some of the research from Armstrong and Hagel, because they talk about 2 different kinds of community online. The community of fantasy and the community of relationship. Fantasy is very much the escapism, getting away for a while and playing someone different. But communities of relationship is a space where, under that assumed username, people can talk about their ideas, share their experiences, share stories and knowledge. it takes on a much more therapeutic role and a much more communal role in that social role in that sense. Okay, so social media and gaming in general have these ideas. And one particular interesting article I read by Pearson talks about social media as a glass bedroom. This analogy is kind of important because if you're talking about, for example, Facebook or Twitter, students will basically be happy to talk about their most intimate thoughts, be open, be vulnerable on a social media space, but might not necessarily take into account that the walls are transparent. Depending on your privacy settings, anybody can come in and view and communicate on what you post. So for a lot of our students, maybe just possibly they see the online space as a chance to open up, knowing that it's not quite the same as speaking to other learners face to face in that classroom environment. Now, this gives rise to two ideas here. The L2 virtual self, which is this identity the students are creating online, but you've also got the L2 ideal self, which Dornier gave us in 2005, and that's the idea of the learner that the student wants to be when they're learning a second language. The question, though, is, are they the same thing? Is it possible that the L2 virtual self is just a manifestation of that ideal online, which works better for our learners, and it's more just a question of learning styles than anything else? If that's the case, then I'd just like to draw your attention to these things here. You're probably familiar with most of these. Kik, WhatsApp, Kakao Talk is another popular one in South Korea, for instance. Computer-mediated communication is one of the things our students more often than not engage with. And Postmates, Spears and Lee make the point that CMC is a source of liberation for some learners. They feel more empowered and more confident because they're just chatting rather than having that discourse in the classroom environment. Similarly, you had Kopp's idea, which links back to sense making, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, in a connectivist learning online open network. This was a place where students could actually assign their own roles in an online community and work out where their place was in that world, define themselves as a person on that online space. And it got me thinking in a lot of ways, coming back to an article I read recently by Ali in 2004, talking about multi-channel learning as quite an important thing in online education. And the question I would ask there is it a case of multi-channel learning, or is it more a case of a multi-channel learning style? Students have a different self, have a different way of approaching learning in different places, the classroom, online, and maybe it might not just be two, it could be more, in fact. This is possibly something to consider, because it may be that our students learn very well on one particular channel, but within the classroom they become reticent, they find it difficult to participate, and to an extent they feel uncomfortable in that zone. So, to come back to this point, the L2 virtual self suggests sense making, as we mentioned just now, designing meaning, and knowledge building. These are all about establishing a sense of self within the world you're in, within your surroundings. Very transformative, very sociocultural. But by that very definition, if you had to look at the motivation for why students might want to learn in that space, you're kind of suggesting that it's integrative. You're going back to Ellis, you're going back to Dornier and Ushioda, and this motivation is kind of within the student's definition of this wider L2 community. We're not just talking about the class, we're not even just talking about the language school now. We're talking about something reaching much further and much wider. transnational, as Warshauer would put it back in 2000. So, the possible conclusions there would be that factors influencing language learning may not all be due to the teacher or the classroom. They could be external, they could be environmental. I think a lot of research backs that up, though. So that's a more obvious conclusion. Oh, I've run on to... Okay. I've gone very quickly, haven't I? Sorry. Eh? I apologise for that. It might be, yeah. Sorry. I thought it was going to be 25. It's gone to 10. I've gone way too quick. Sorry about this. Sorry about this. But the other thing is, by harnessing the L2 virtual self as well as the learner's self within the classroom, a teacher could increase motivation, participation. You could create keener contributors in the class, actually. And that question, the question that comes up then is how the teacher approaches it. Can we just use some of the more traditional blends that you see in language schools, the web quests, the guide discovery, the Google Docs? Or do you have to start embracing these communities that students are comfortable being part of, embracing computer-mediated communication, and letting both channels of this learning style run through? I think that's probably the next step. And certainly in further research, what I'm going to look at is certainly seeing whether this L2 virtual self is present, but also how we might put possible solutions in to harness it in class. Okay, I appear to have gone through quicker than I anticipated. Thank you very much. Any questions?